down, a little depressing and such. But really what I hope to accomplish by the time we're done with this session is to give you some very practical understanding of grief, as well as giving you some tools to help people who are dealing with grief themselves. Grief is a universal. Everybody who's ever loved has grieved. Grief, we oftentimes, the first thing we think about is death. But grief actually has to do with processing, the natural human emotion or processing of any loss. You know, it's very easy for us to, you know, somewhat put in the checkbox, you know, death of a spouse, things like that. But people who experience significant loss in their life, such as a job, such as abilities, I know a man who processed grief every time he had an amputation because a little bit of him was now gone, removed from his body. It can certainly be other relationships, even with the living, you know, such as divorce or friendships, things of that nature. You know, grief has been called the cost or the price of living. Again, because we attach ourselves to people and even occasionally things. You lose everything to a fire, you might experience grief. But it is also a very positive thing in the sense that grief demonstrates love. And going back to that previous analogy, not love of things, but the memories that are attached, you know, to those things would be what you probably grieve the most. You know, one of the things that you'll find, no matter what and where your ministry is, to whom, whatever age group you're a part of, is that people who hurt look a lot like people who don't hurt. People who need help look a lot like people that don't need help. And one of the things that you have to also understand when looking at the bigger picture of grief is that it has primary losses and secondary losses associated with it. Let me give you an example. Somebody loses a spouse. Terrible in and of itself. But now they might also be dealing with, how do I socialize? You know, like Batman and Robin, we've done everything together. We're almost, you know, Siamese twins joined at the hip. How do I work with friendships? Who's gonna cut the lawn now? I don't have the understanding to do some of the things, you know, for example, my wife does. How is that gonna take place? You know, the decorations of our house are gonna go like this if anything ever happened to her. My wife Patty, by the way, faithful friend for 40 years now. Yeah, a long time putting up with me, that's for sure. You know, even just something as simple as, you know, you're used to the comfort of going to bed with somebody and that person's no longer there and the bed's cold. There's all sorts of experiences that are associated with grief. And you've probably heard of the 5 stages of grief. Really common thing. In the late 60s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book called The 5 Stages of Grief. And one of the things about it, the 5 stages, and again, if you sign up in the back, I will send you an email with a bunch of very helpful, very to the point resources, including a page of other resources you can refer your people to. But Elizabeth Kubler-Ross broke down grief into 5 different groups. First, there's the stage of denial. That can't be. I just talked to him yesterday. Anger. Anger can be directed at the person. Why did you do such a stupid thing like drink and drive and then you end up killing yourself and leaving me behind? Could be anger at God. God, I've been faithful all these years. Does that sound familiar from the scripture? About a third of the Psalms, David was complaining about something that he felt injustice from God. So anger against God, I want to pause for just a moment on that. Anger against God is okay. He has shoulders big enough to handle it. But what I always tell people is when you're done venting your anger to God, be ready to listen. And I use the book of Job as that. Job complained, and then God says, brace yourself like a man, I'm about to speak. I love that. Then there's bargaining. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then there's depression, and then there's acceptance. I want to show you the clinical studies have proved, you know, this is great because it got people starting to talk about grief. But clinical studies have not shown grief to be linear, not to be controllable. This is the clinical description of how grief works in a person's life. This is acceptance. This is the point of loss. That is about it. There can be good days, there can be bad days, there can be days where you feel like you've finally been able to come to a place of at least general acceptance, and all of a sudden, wham, you feel like you're right back to within minutes of that loss, whatever it could be. You know, we do prefer, as, you know, I'm a chaplain, I'm a healthcare chaplain, I have pastored. I want to be real quick to point out, I believe that whatever ministry you're involved in is, if it's unto the Lord, it's equally valid. But one of the things that we tend to do, I'll just say as pastors, is, you know, we prefer something neatly packaged that we can fix. You know, you probably heard the term closure. You know, we're working towards closure. Well, I want to just hit that right in the face, that closure has to do with closing, you know, the chapter, closing the book, closing the door. Who in the world wants to close their memories of their loved one? Yeah. Not me. Grief, its ultimate goal is the process of acceptance. It's the process of acceptance. Grief is a journey, it's not a destination. That's something really important to remind people, because if you've had a significant loss, you can tell me you feel like nothing will ever get better from this point forward. And what you do find, especially if we rely on the Lord, is that we get closer to accepting it. Another way of putting that is finding the new normal. We want to help people find the new normal. Life after grief will never, ever, ever be the same. But it can be good. There's a little young one there. How old?
6 months.
6 months. Have you ever had anybody say, yeah, you're celebrating this new birth and you're all excited and you're thrilled. When are you going to get back to life as normal? Stop being so happy about this stuff. You know, we do that. We don't do that for birth. Why do we do that for grief? When are you going to get on with your life? When are you going to go back to normal? It's more comfortable for us, but it's not comfortable for them, nor should we require that of people. It is a continuing process of acceptance. And when I did this, I actually got a little carried away with the marker. I want to stop there because you never fully accept it. Never fully accept it. But life can still be good. Life can still have hope, as we talked about last night. Life can still have meaning. Life can still have purpose. Life can have joy once again. Will it be different? Absolutely. But can it be good? Our God is faithful, amen? It can be good. So our goal is not to have our people, whether it's friends, whether it's family, whether it's parishioners, co-workers. Our goal is not to get them to stop grieving. Our goal is to help them in the midst of that journey of grief. And there's a lot of different things that we can do to get them there. The process often is a lifetime. It's a lifetime. My mom and dad died 18 or so years ago. I still miss them almost every day I think about them. That's okay. Do I grieve the same as I did when they first died? No, of course not. But I still miss them. It's a lifelong process. I'm going to paint with a very broad brush for just a minute, if you'll allow me. Women often grieve, and I'm saying often because it's not a universal. There is no universal way a person grieves. Twins in the same family losing a parent will grieve differently. But women often grieve expressing emotion and reaching out to others for help. And they call it intuitive grieving. They just seem to know, I can't do this alone. It's okay to cry. And they typically, because relationships are so important to them, typically reach out to others for help. Men typically are less demonstrative in their grief, especially in this, culture that we live in called North Dakota, where you have to have a permission slip from the principal to be able to cry. Men typically don't demonstrate a lot of tears, and they typically find physical outlets. They take on new projects, and these projects are often done in isolation. They hide in the man cave, so to speak. They go out to the garage, they work on an engine they've been putting off for 20 years, that kind of thing. And that's called instrumental grief. They find relief from their grief, or they process their grief by using something as a means or an outlet. But again, I want to share with you that there's no universal. And that's one of the things that will oftentimes be a challenge for you, caring for somebody who's grieving, is that you may have a certain thing that worked for this person and a certain approach that worked for this person and worked for this person. Now this next person comes and nothing seems to stick, nothing seems to help. Because everyone grieves differently. And I want to share with you, you need to give them permission to grieve how they want to grieve. Give them permission to be themselves. We don't force anything upon them. We let them express themselves. And just one more time, because we've had a couple of newer folks come in the room. On the back, if you wish to just put your name and your email, I want to send you some resources that I found extremely helpful. I'm not going to subscribe you to anything. It's just going to be a one-shot deal. And if you want to interact with me and have other things sent your way, I can do that. But it's just a one-time thing, and I think you'll appreciate some of them at the very least. Some for use for yourself, some to give to somebody who is grieving. One of the things that is almost universally helpful, though, is to encourage people to express their emotions. Somebody a lot smarter than me said the only bad tear is one not shed. Allow people to express their emotions, and here it is. Do so in a safe environment with no judgment at all. In other words, let people be people. Let humans be humans. Oftentimes, and I've found working with various denominations, and I'm an Assembly of God minister, but oftentimes in the Assembly of God, we have this veneer where we have this person we show everybody. And then we have the person that we see in the mirror. And sometimes the person that we see in the mirror is a little rawer, a little bit more emotional, a little bit less in control, a little less presentable. Allow that person to be in your office. Allow that person to say, I am so stinking mad at God, and he might even not use the word bad. But I am so ticked off at God. Why would he do this? All of these things. Let them express that. Because right away we want to say, oh no, God is still good. Let them be mad at God. They'll come around. They'll come around. But let them express those thoughts, those sentiments. Sometimes grief is what they call ambiguous. And that is when the person is not physically there. Think of the man or the woman whose spouse is deployed in the military. That person's still alive. That person's still around. But that person's alarm is going off. That's my wife, that's my teaser. Well, maybe not, I'll probably pay for it later. Time to get the donuts. But that's a legitimate grief, that person is physically somewhere else. Then there is a disenfranchised grief, where a person experiences grief that society doesn't necessarily let you. Pets, for example. I learned, actually quite late in my chaplaincy, that people can become as attached to pets as they can to humans. And I remember talking to somebody that their cat of 16 years, and I'm not a fan of cats, that's just me, I'm saying it's a rule for you guys, but I'm not a fan of cats. And she said, my cat of 15, 16 years died. I said, oh, I'm sorry for that. You going to the meeting? I just glossed over it when she wanted to probably cry and just, share her feelings. A lot of times, that's not acceptable. And sometimes people that have gone through divorce, when their ex-spouse dies, they grieve. How do we deal with that? That's not societally acceptable. You're not really permitted to do that in our society. And there's some that are more on the fringe. When Princess Diana died, there were people who were genuinely grieving. And for those of the younger generation, Google it and you'll understand a little bit. And one of the things that I deal with quite often, I'm a hospice chaplain, so I typically am working with people or families who know that they have 6 months or less to live. And there's something called anticipatory grief, where they know what's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Or another example of that is somebody who's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Because the person may still be there, but the person who used to be in that shell we call a body is not the same as the one that we see right now. Grief affects every fabric of our being. It affects our emotions, sadness, guilt, anger, loneliness. It affects our thought life. Why me? Why now? How am I ever going to deal with this? I'll never get over this. I can't imagine life without that person. Behaviors. And I don't call this a behavior like something that a child has bad behaviors, but crying, withdrawal, easily snaps. You ever talk to somebody and like, whoa, didn't know we were going there. You just kind of, it's okay though. When a person's grieving, you have to allow for that. And in some sense, develop thicker skin if you're ministering to that person. And it also affects our wellness. Grieving oftentimes affects our eating, less interest in food. It certainly affects sleeping, headaches, high blood pressure. There's a lot of things that are all tied up and connected to grief. Let me just pause for a second. Any questions so far? This is kind of like drinking with a straw from a fire hydrant, isn't it? It's just a lot of stuff. And that's why I really want to advocate you looking to getting those resources, because this will give you time to process on your own. Grief oftentimes peaks 4 to 6 months after a loss. You think it should be like right away. But when a person is planning a funeral, typically the pastor's there, typically other family are either there or they're flying in or they're driving in. Friends and neighbors are all kind of, swarming in a good sense all over you and about you. But what happens when the funeral's over, that changes. And all of that support and that safety net you once had. And also because we deny it, because we tend to get angry, because we tend to bargain, we're actually not facing the full shock of the loss right away. That's why it takes 4 to 6 months. I'm very thankful to the Lord that He wired us the way we did. He is like a master electrician, where He allows a certain amount of the grief to process, to go in, because grief has to be processed. It will show up one way or the other. But He allows a certain amount to come our way, and when it becomes too much, He throws the breaker. He shuts it off for that time being. That's enough. That's all they can handle. But there's still more to process. There's still more grief involved. So He puts that breaker back to the on position, and more comes. and then he shuts it down, and more comes. You know, Mother Teresa is famous for her expression, I know God will never give me more than I can handle, I just wish he didn't trust me so much.
Yeah.
God is very gracious in allowing us to process grief in portions that we can handle. Because if we ever face the totality of a loss of a significant loved one, at one time, there's not one of us that would stand. Aren't you glad that he gives it to us in portions? Now, part of us is saying, okay, God, we can hurry this up a little bit. You know, I'm tired of being sad, I'm tired of being tired. But he knows what we can handle, what we should deal with, what we can wait a little bit further down the road to deal with. And I also want to share something that might be encouraging to you, it might be very discouraging to you. How long does it take a person to come to that close to acceptance, finding that new normal? On a significant loved one, husband, wife, mother, father, 3 years. 3 years. Now, it's not 3 deep, dark years. It's a climbing, it's a journey. Please remind your people, I'm reminding you, grief is a journey, it's not a destination. It's a land you pass through, it's a season you go through. But you're not gonna be that way forever. But it takes about 3 years to find your footing. If you've ever been on a cruise or even a larger boat for any extended period of time, you find that when you're traveling on the water and you finally go back to land, what does it feel like? It feels like you're still moving. The land is still very solid, but it feels like you're still moving. I really liken in the grief context for that sea to be the loss and the land to be Christ. We feel like we're still moving with the current, but in fact, we're in a very safe place because the Lord is there and he's undergirding us. Does it make it easy? Easier. Eventually that soaks in and we find, man, I just can't believe, Jesus, how you carried me through that time. I want to share, does grief get better every day? Kind of. But there are also triggers. Can you think of a trigger? What might trigger grief after you think you're getting better? I'm using that in quotations. What's a trigger? Those of you who've grieved.
A scent.
A scent, yeah. A smell can pull it out. I associate, my wife still has some clothing of her mother. She sniffs every now and then.
An item.
An item, yeah. Something associated to that person.
Holidays.
Holidays, yes. Birthdays, anniversaries. You know, you might feel like you're starting to ride the crest of the wave, and all of a sudden it's December 25th and they're not there, and you feel like you've just wiped out and crashed, and that's normal. That's okay. That's the Lord giving you time and more time to process things. This is a little bit more humorous, although it's extremely accurate. Oftentimes, there's that point where you sense your loss, whether it's anticipating the loss or actually experiencing. David, I'm sorry, this is Chaplain so-and-so from the Nashville Police Department, your brother is dead. You know, that's that point right there. And then this is the grief cycle. And from that, there's like those birthdays, those anniversaries. There's, you know, maybe a day that's special. Patty and I met on January 7th, 1984. You know, that's a day I hope to be able to remember. It's not our wedding day, but you know, it's an important day, and if something should happen to her, and you know, if something should happen to me, hopefully she'll remember that day. And that'll probably trigger something. Now, the pain is deep and hard right there, but over time, as you're dealing with grief, not ignoring it, but as you're dealing with grief, it can become less. But every now and then, let's just say this is Christmas, and you think you're doing really well, all of a sudden, you might have a really tough holiday, and it might pull you almost back to that same hurt of the first Christmas. And one of the things you want to let your people know is that is okay. That does not mean there's no hope. That does not mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're human. It means you love that person. Going back to closure, you know, we talk about this closure. When you close the door on grief, you also close the door on good memories. And one of the things that I have found very important to give, I don't give advice, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit, but one of the, and nor should you. But one of the things that I've really found helpful when ministering to people who are grieving is to remember the whole person. In other words, was there good in that person? Oh, absolutely. Were there some things that just drove you nuts and get angry every time you think about it? Absolutely. And don't convert the deceased into a saint. If you want to grieve properly, grieve the whole person, not just the parts that are easier to deal with. You know, I mean, am I telling the truth? I mean, even in good relationships, there's just that thing. Or, you know, those things in my case, her with me. Those things that just, oh, I'm not gonna miss that, but I sure miss that person. How do you know, and I'm still kind of talking on the information side, not so much going into the helpful parts, but and we will get to that, I promise. But how do you know if the grief needs some intervention? You know, there is something called complicated grief. Complicated grief. How long did I say it takes to find that new normal on a significant loved one?
3 years.
Complicated grief is when you experience another loss in that 3 years period. My father died. Tough. 14 months later, my mother died. I didn't get over my father. Now I gotta deal with two. And unfortunately, it's a synergistic formula that the sum of the parts is greater than the parts individually. So you can expect that person to be grappling with this, not 3 years from the second loss, but it could be actually quite a bit longer. And again, that's how we're built, and it's okay. And if, you know, I don't wanna be insensitive. If there's somebody here, you know, that is currently grieving somebody, it's okay to grieve. That means you love them. It means you're human. And the fact that you're grieving shows that God is at work in you to help heal you. One of the concepts that we truly understand is our resurrected Christ, when he was altogether and permanently transformed after the resurrection, still had scars. Still had scars. And grief will sometimes leave some scars, but it also, when you look at it, it's a testimony that I went through that and I made it. When should you get help? Well, you might decide that somebody needs additional help if the grief has gotten worse over an extended period of time. And by that I mean they're still even less social, or they're even less social, probably a proper diction there. They have extreme anger or guilt. My wife and I have a really good friend who was driving a vehicle and he bent over to adjust the radio, turned the vehicle over, and his father died. There probably was a lot of guilt. Or I'm currently helping somebody in a grief support group the family gathered for family pictures, And the husband said, well, I'm not feeling so well, I'm gonna leave a little early. And the wife said, why didn't I tell him to stay and not drive him home instead of him getting hit by another car? You know, might not even be your fault. Might have nothing to do with an action that you did, but sometimes the anger can intensify. Can also intensify towards God. Don't you like that? David says, how come you did this? God says, hang on now. But sometimes it can be, how come you did this? And it just gets worse and worse and worse. Might want to get some sort of help. And by that I mean professional help. Or a support group. Or something other than what they're doing currently. You know, you, with the power of the Holy Spirit, can do an awful lot. But the clearest thing of expertise is knowing when you can't help any longer. Knowing when it's beyond you. And sometimes it's just as simple, again, as a support group, but sometimes they might need professional counseling. And you might decide you need help or the person needs help if after several months you still have sudden knee-jerk reactions that are incapacitating. You're in the grocery store, you see his or her favorite cereal, and you just absolutely fall apart. That's an indication that they probably need a little more help than what is available to them at that point. One that, or some cues that this person definitely needs help, and again, the help can vary, support group all the way to professional counseling, is when they are so depressed for such an extended period of time that they're no longer good to themselves or anybody else. You know, there's functional depression where you can still help others even though you feel empty as a shell on the inside. But sometimes you no longer have any interaction or engagement towards anybody else. That's a definite sign. If someone turns to drugs or alcohol, or turns more towards drugs or alcohol. I'm assuming you guys have interactions with people that are not the pristine, squeaky clean Assembly of God folks that are all over our pews. And you know, you encounter people that drink, and there may be one or two in the church that might turn more drinking. Okay? Or obviously, and or I should say, I hope this is obvious, if they talk about intentional harm, either A, I'm gonna kill that person that, you know, made my son drink too much, or they wanna harm themselves. They need help. They need help beyond what you have. And in terms of suicide ideation or murderous ideation, you need to get interventions right away. There's no way around it. I honestly think if I was dealing with somebody who mentioned that they wanted to kill themselves, and there are ways to investigate how legitimate their concerns are, you know, do you have a plan, do you have a means? But if they say, I'm gonna do this and I don't do anything about it, that blood's on my hands as well. I didn't make the choice, but I made the choice not to care. One of the things, and these are, now I'm gonna start hopefully giving you some things that are actually going to help you in helping others with grief. You know, again, I could talk on grief for 10 hours. It's hard to talk on grief for less than an hour. So there's lots of things I would love to fill in those gaps, but I'm not able to. Do not try to hasten their grief. In hospice, oftentimes there are certain symptoms that a dying person will have that are very uncomfortable to watch. And oftentimes, we who have been in the situation know they're not hurting, but they're making noises that are not comfortable. So the request is, let's give them some medication so that we can be more comfortable. I mean, they won't articulate that, but that's really what's happening. A lot of times we want to hurry someone up to get better so that we feel better. You know, dealing with somebody, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, working with somebody who's grieving, it's kind of messy. Grief is sneaky. Grief comes up when you don't expect it. It's not convenient. What was that expression you showed me from the Ultimate Resource of Life Facebook? Grief is like glitter. You can clean it up, but there's still some there. I want to suggest, rather than thinking of ways you can fix somebody, to think of ways that you can companion somebody. After the resurrection, there were two men walking on the road to Emmaus, and they were grieving. A lot of theologians think one of those guys was actually Luke himself. A lot of times when the ancients wrote about themselves, it was a certain person. That's just something you might want to just consider. That might have been Luke's born-again experience. But Jesus, while he did articulate the scripture and explain things to them, he walked with them first. Yeah, imagine, honey, stand up and walk for a minute. You know, one of the things you need to do is you need to worry about making sure you don't, how about we just pull up alongside? Didn't even scare you. We just pull up alongside. Just pull up alongside that person. If you don't know what to say, take that as a sign from God and keep your mouth shut. He will put words in your mouth sometimes. But, well, he's in a better place. Or one of my least favorite, because it's theologically wrong, God must have needed an angel. Well, take someone else. Leave that person here.
He's already got angels.
Think of all the good that you guys did together. Oh crap, there's more good I could have done together. Crap's a farm term, by the way. It's not. I'm hoping around these folks I can at least say that. Accept that you cannot take away their pain. Oftentimes we who are in ministry, we have a bit of a Messiah complex ourselves. I can do this. I can fix this. I can make this better. I can fix this marriage. I can do this. No, just accept you can't. A personal visit, a phone call, writing a note can be comforting. And sometimes, even like giving them a plant that they can associate with the lost, but they can nurture it. Things of that nature. When someone's grieving, their energy levels are going to be low. They'll tire easily. Keep your visits short. When someone is hurting, do not say, if you need something. How many of you have ever asked somebody for help? Probably maybe one in the crowd. That's okay, good. I'm glad for that. We talked earlier before you got here that women tend to reach out for help. And I don't know what's wrong with us. But don't offer to help, just help. Yeah. Who's taking care of the food for you guys? You're grieving, you don't want to cook for 20 people. Yeah. Who's cutting your lawn? What arrangements have you set up? I mean, if you really want to help somebody, you sometimes need to roll up your sleeves, and it takes more than nice words. And hopefully you can develop a team, if we're talking about a church context, you can develop a team within your church that wants to provide that type of simple comfort. I know churches that they have meals covered for the first month. Think of what a load that takes off somebody. Realize that your friend is a unique individual and they're going to grieve in their own unique way. Give them permission to express their pain without judging. People have said some very uncomfortable, for me, things. not everyone I deal with is church folk. And they can use some very descriptive language and even attributing it to God. And I would love to come to God's defense the moment they say something. But that doesn't necessarily mean A, that's what they need, or B, that they'd accept it. Let them, give them permission to vent their grief. Even say words that are never spoken ever again in a church. Now, I mean, you don't give them the microphone, but give them in a nice, safe area. Words can be insensitive. You may have even experienced a similar loss. You don't know how they feel. Never say, I know how you feel. That produces resentment. How could you possibly know how I feel? Sometimes relationships, they grieve more because they're good. Sometimes they grieve more because they're bad. They were bad. And they mourn the loss of potential to get it better. Again, remember, you don't have to say anything. Sometimes just being there is all that matters. I want to share just quickly one story from my life. I was doing hospital rounds in Minot, saw somebody that I knew in the emergency room waiting area. Wasn't on my rounds, but I decided, of course, to stop. Turned out his brother was in an accident. He's on life support. I was there with the family for hours and hours and hours after that point. Crying with them, comforting them, shutting up and just being there. Came to the point where later they had to make the choice to remove life support. I was there through the whole thing. I was asked if I could do the funeral. I said I would be honored. I'd do the funeral. Went to the funeral home and stood next to the widow, who said, "Who are you?" Then she looked down and saw my wingtip shoes. "You're the pastor." Who I was didn't mean anything. The fact that I was there meant everything. You know, there's oftentimes not a whole lot of recognition for what we do. That's okay, because we're not doing it for them. We're doing it because that's exactly what the Lord would do. I came up with my own definitions. Jesus has never been said to have sympathy on somebody. Jesus has never been said to have empathy, but he did have compassion. Sympathy is a cognitive recognition of somebody experiencing a loss. Oh, you lost your brother. I'm sorry. Hope you didn't.
No.
See, you lost your brother. Didn't have a brother. That's sympathy. Empathy is, oh man, that hurts. Compassion is caring enough to do something about it. That's what we're called to do. We're called to have compassion. Feeling something is one thing, and that's good. That's good to be in touch with that. But we're called to have compassion. And when Jesus had compassion on people, he did something to meet their needs. The final stages of grief, there's a lot of shock, a lot of denial. Sometimes people think they're going crazy because all of a sudden they're coming to the realization of, my world is not the world that I've known for the last umpteen years. Reassure them it's normal. Provide reassurance that these expressions, these emotions are normal. And it's also very important, while caring for others, that you care for yourself. In part, physically. We don't talk a lot about that in the Assemblies of God, but the other part, spiritually. You know, we don't do a whole lot of good, nor do cars when they're running on fumes. You know, we need to tank up with the Holy Spirit. We need to sometimes, you know, find that quiet place and just allow yourself opportunity. I got a couple more things I want to share, and then I'll hopefully be able to help with some questions. I talked about companioning. Companioning is about honoring the spirit, not focusing on the intellect. You might have a lot of really wise things to share with somebody, But at that point, they're not necessarily looking for that. You know, that old expression, they don't care how much you know, they wanna know how much you care. Companioning is about curiosity, not expertise. I've been a healthcare chaplain for 20 years. I've been bedside probably literally 200 to 300 people as they've died. I don't consider myself an expert because I have so much more I can learn. It's just drawing alongside. Companionship is learning from others, not necessarily teaching them. Again, it's about walking alongside, not leading them. It's about discovering, I like this expression, I work for a Catholic organization, sacred silence. I love that. Sometimes that quiet time is a very sacred place to be in. Companioning is about listening with the heart, not analyzing with the head. And honestly, I think guys, I'm gonna point us out. We like to fix things. We like to tuck in those corners and neat and packaged. It's not about that. Companioning is about bearing witness to another person's pain. It's not about taking the pain away. Companioning is about respecting disorder. People's lives are shaken. We don't have to put things back together. We just have to be there sometimes. And companioning is about going to the wilderness of the world with another human being. A lot of uncharted territory out there. Somebody who's grieving has never been in that trail before, that exact trail. Explore it with them. And we will find that as we lean on the Holy Spirit, even to non-churched folks, if we lean on the Holy Spirit, transformation can take place in those that we're ministering to, regardless of if they have faith or even if they don't. Grief is a lonely place to be, and simply knowing that somebody cares is the first step towards coming to the process of acceptance. Don't ever use the word closure again. Do me that favor. Don't close the door on somebody that they loved. Just help them to find that new normal. I had a few minutes for questions, about 8 or 9 minutes or so. I was told to be very prompt and respect the next class. Yes?
So how do you, there's a couple times you said, allow people to vent on their grief, or, maybe even if that means using maybe if there was like a colorful word, or maybe if there was like maybe a very emotional, I don't want to say outburst, but emotional moment or something like that. And the way that I have lived my life, I've always been a very, be self-controlled, suck it up, like move on kind of person. So how would you navigate, help being with someone as they, I guess maybe develop the fruit of the Spirit in their life? I think about someone being honest and maybe venting emotion, but then also having, the fruit of the Spirit of, self-control
Sure.
and patience. So how do you kind of navigate those situations where, maybe, typically we'd be looking for like sanctification or discipleship, something like that.
Well, obviously that it's all of our heart's desire is to bring people closer to the Lord. But oftentimes, in the midst of their grief, that is not where they're at. And we have to remind ourselves as care providers that it's not about us, it's about them. And the only way that they are going to get to that point is if they can be honest about how they feel. If you squash that part of their grieving, they're not going to get it out. And it'll come out in other ways, anger, harm.
Mm-hmm.
So you simply exercise the fruit of the Spirit of patience in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And get beyond your comfort zone. I'm not saying, make every time you're together with them a rant and a rave and that, but it's gonna come out sometimes. And it's validate their humanity, before you start working into their spiritual realm is what I would have to say to that. I think that's a great question though, because yeah, we can't take away the pain, but we can draw alongside it. Yeah.
I got a comment and a question. I know as a pastor, been a pastor for quite a few years, and sometimes a lot of guilt was put on me when someone's going through a grief process because I'm not calling on them enough to solve the problem.
Mhm.
And when you go see them, that you might, your chart over there in the right-hand corner, you might, one time you might be picking them off the ceiling, and the next time you might be scraping them off the floor of the basement. And they're all over the place. I had a lady years ago that lost her husband, and quite suddenly. And there was a gentleman in our town, that won't mention the name, but I'll talk about it later. He was doing a grief recovery course. I sent her to that. You have no idea what that did for me. It saved my life. What I could not do, and the guilt was put on me, and I was allowing it to be put on me, what people do to me, but there are solutions to those problems. The question for you is, do we have anything around the state like that, or do you teach them those courses or whatever? I know you're giving us a lot of helps as individuals that we can put in place that are very helpful, but sometimes a little session in grief recovery can be very helpful.
Well, I do lead grief support groups in two cities currently. It's gonna change in the summer, go to 4 cities. But again, if you'd sign up, Daryl, for the.
I'll sign up.
I will send a resource page that includes grief support groups. There's some very good websites that are designed for the grieving that are like mini sessions in and of themselves. Little videos to handle this particular part of the grief. Very
I know there's also
non-overpowering.
some really good books too now that have come out in the last.
Sure, well, there's great books, but typically, how many times other than the Bible have you had the chance or this, time to read a book? Now, most people don't. So, while I like books, I like them a lot, most people I've found don't benefit from that. And I wanna send you guys, some of the other things people can do to journal, to get their feelings out of themselves, and, you can be that person they journal to by expressing their feelings, but having them write it down, it can be very helpful. Grief support groups, I love them. There is a task in mourning to acknowledge the reality of the loss, to experience the pain of grief, to remember the person who died, to remember not just the good parts that you want to remember, but sometimes the trouble, to develop a new identity, to find new meaning, and receive ongoing support from others. That is what the process of coming to, grief can be really complicated by other things, not having time to say goodbye. Death of a child as opposed to death of a parent. The intensity of the relationship, good relationships, bad relationships. How long you've known the person. How did they die? Did they die by suicide? What do you do with that? Society doesn't want to talk about that. Lots of things, but I'm so comforted that Jesus wept. He knew the end of the story. He knew what was gonna happen, and he knows what's ultimately gonna happen. But just because you know the end of the story doesn't mean you can't cry during the sad parts. And if I could give you any little theological addition, and this will probably be where I close, and again, I'll still answer any questions if I try to at least, is a funeral is an important rite of mourning, R-I-T-E, rite of mourning. We as Christians don't often use that word because we associate it with paganism, but a rite of mourning is a socially acceptable device by which you can transfer from one place to another, from being the bereaved to beginning to start the journey of grief. Do not, please do not ever say The Apostle Paul said, we don't grieve as those who have no hope, so let's rejoice and have a party. I have heard that. And even if that is the tone the family would like to have, please allow in that service an opportunity to recognize that that person is not with us. It will be different. You have experienced a loss. Can we rejoice they're not in pain anymore? Sure we can. Can we rejoice that they're finally with their Jesus, that they've been waiting with some cases 10, 15, 20 years with a debilitating disease? Of course we can. And we ought. But the Apostle Paul didn't say we don't grieve. He said we don't grieve like those people who don't have hope. Let people grieve. Best thing you can do. Best thing you can do to start the healing journey that God will do. And hopefully, through you. 1 more minute, 2 more minutes. Hopefully, my heart's desire was that, we'd have a little broader sense of grief, what it is, what it involves. Hopefully a little better understanding of how devastating grief can be. But also I hope I gave you even just a small handful of things so that you can be better in your care for those. And last time I say it, promise, Boy Scouts honor and all that stuff. If you sign up, I'm gonna send you about 10 sheets of helpful resources, including one sheet will be a resource page of resources that you can investigate, and I'll even explain what they're all about, why I think they're useful. So what I couldn't get done in 1 hour, I hope to help more just down the road. Again, I thank you so much for caring enough about hurting people that you chose to be here. And if you're grieving and you feel like you're in a rut, please reach out to somebody that you can trust. They don't have to be experts, just somebody you can trust. And we do find that God doesn't remove the pain, but he removes the sting. And we can walk in a newness of life, even after having lost something very valuable. Class dismissed.
Did you have any questions?